The last lecture. Yay! You made it. Well, I've had a good time. I hope you've had something of a good time. I hope you feel a little bit more like you know about what caused plagues and what things were like for people during, the history of those plagues. So this is the last lecture, and this is probably the scariest, which is how ready are we to withstand a terrorist attack or biological warfare. Just like nuclear warfare, this can be very serious, and hopefully not. Hopefully, this will never happen. There are treaties in place, but you never know. Okay, so responding to bioterrorism and biological warfare. Come on, go. All right, so manufacturing of new biological weapons. So, there's genetic engineering now. There's a process called CRISPR, and that's you can actually buy some of those machines, and that's where you modify genes, you modify, the order and all of that. It's pretty simple. It doesn't cost very much, and everything you need costs about $300-400. So it lowers the barrier, or it increases the ability for the average Joe to actually create biological weapons, or rogue nations, if you will. Anyway, but it isn't. It's easy to perform, but it isn't always easy to get the bug the way you want it to. If that makes sense. So you can do it a lot, but getting the right thing is difficult. So the three simplest means of creating a biological weapon are the worst, almost the worst. So the first is recreating a known pathogen, like a virus, like Ebola. The second is making biochemicals via in situ, which means in a test tube synthesis, or making bacteria more dangerous. So those are the simplest, and those can be very, very bad. Then the next one is the next level is making existing viruses more dangerous. That's a little more difficult. And manufacturing chemicals or biochemicals by exploiting natural metabolic pathways of like bacteria to create lots of them. And then we go down to manufacturing chemicals, modifying the human microbiome, modifying the human immune system, modifying the human genome. These are possible, but they're hard to do. They're really hard to do. And then down at the bottom, we have, or the second to the bottom, recreating known pathogenic bacteria. You really got to start from something. You can't just create it. It's just more difficult. Or creating new pathogens. It's really difficult to create something new. And then the lowest relative concern is modifying the human genome using human gene drives. So that's where someone might be able to change your genome by some outside method. But anyway, the top three, the worst case scenario, are the easiest: recreating known pathogenic viruses, making biochemicals via test tube synthesis, and making existing bacteria more dangerous. So a normal bacteria, so like a skin bacteria, Staphylococcus epidermidis, normal skin bacteria, but all of a sudden you make it virulent and everybody has it. Ooh, it's going to be a problem. All right. So common bacterial practices around the world are making existing bacteria more dangerous. There's a lot of people doing that, United States included, and altering organisms to produce different biochemicals. So bacteria on their own produce lots of different biochemicals and for their own use, if you will. But we can insert genes to make them produce different things. So for instance, this hasn't been done yet, but I'll just give an example. Have a bacteria that's able to create ricin toxin, and then that bacteria can produce scads of it, but that hasn't been done yet. So recreating known viruses sounds difficult, but it's not. Isn't that crazy? In 2002, some scientists recreated the polio virus from internet instructions and mail order biomolecules that were available to anybody. Yeah, not good. So given most rogue nations have teams of experts, teams of scientists, etc., there are some really serious possibilities and consequences. So have I scared you yet? Well, there's more coming. So what should happen in our world to prevent this or to recognize it or whatever? Well, of course, emergency physicians need to be trained to know what are the basic pathological symptoms, etc., and the method of action for Class A and Class B agents. So what does smallpox look like if you've never seen it before? What does plague look like if you've never seen it before? What if you have 1,000 or say 500 people coming in with a disease? How do you figure out what it is rapidly? Emergency physicians also need to know how it is disseminated and transmitted, because they've got a whole hospital full of people that can be infected if it's aerosolized. What are the disease signs and symptoms? How do you diagnose it? What's the therapy for it? Are there vaccines? Are there medicines? Is there a way to prevent it in the rest of the population? And how do you control the infection in your own hospital? Now, most emergency room physicians have lots of things going on, and although physicians are required to have continuing education all the time, most emergency room physicians are not as well versed on this kind of stuff as we would hope, because there's just such a, it's rare that they would have to use it. And any kind of knowledge that you have a class 3 years ago, it's unlikely you're going to remember a lot of it as you go forward, in for the next 3 to 5 years, etc. It doesn't mean there are some very well trained emergency room physicians. I'm not saying that, but just kind of overall picture in the U.S. All right, so how would a physician recognize it? Well, so the patient presents with signs or symptoms of a suspect disease. So like, let's say smallpox, they come in with that typical smallpox rash. Or someone comes in and you draw some blood, or you do a swab and you see, oh my gosh, it's this, So those are the primary ways. Then we can also, the patient presents with symptoms, fever, headache, malaise, vomiting, diarrhea, whatever, which is everything. And so if you are able to do a diagnostic test, grow it in the laboratory or do an antibody test or something. If you suspect it to be, let's say, smallpox again, but it doesn't look exactly like smallpox, or you think it's tularemia, but you're not really sure, well, the physician would likely or should designate you as a presumptive case until you get confirmation from the laboratory or from other health experts. 3 others, 5 different scenarios. So third, the patient presents, but not suspected as a victim of bioterrorism. But you do a diagnostic test on them anyway, thinking they have the flu, and you find out that it's pneumonic plague. And so then you have a diagnosis. The other way is if you do a post-mortem, so you do an autopsy on the patient and you find out, oh my gosh, they had Ebola. Okay. And then the fourth is multiple patients present with similar symptoms. So all of a sudden, a bunch of people are coming in and they look like they all have polio, or they all have salmonella or something. That's your clue. It's, a sentinel warning, if you will. And then we do have public health surveillance. So that's when physicians all around your community are reporting diseases to either your public health department or to the CDC. There are reportable diseases. So if a physician in the emergency room or in their regular office sees a certain type of disease, they are required to report it. And the CDC, of course, tracks this in their monthly morbidity and mortality report. I think I mentioned that. You can get that. You can look at it on the CDC. So once the CDC or the public health agency is starting to get some of these reports, and they're going to start looking at okay, why is this happening? Where is this happening? Who is getting sick? Who can we prevent from getting sick? There's also what's called a BioWatch program. And this is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year in 30 major metropolitan areas like Phoenix, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, etc. And these are able to provide an early indication of an airborne biological attack. And this network is operated by scientists, lab techs, emergency managers, law enforcement, etc. So if they see something weird going on, or they're notified that something's weird going on, then these people are the ones that start raising the red flags and investigate immediately. Also, believe it or not, there's something called a biosensor. And the biosensor is able to identify certain things on its receptors that would suggest biological or toxin, et cetera, attack. So some things that it looks for, or some, not all biosensor can detect everything. There's specific biosensors for different things, but enzymes, molecular imprints, antibodies, nucleic acids, etc. They can be detected, and then once they're detected, they send an electrical signal out, like Star Trek red alert. And then those go to an amplifier, which then goes to a computer for one of those scientists, and it says, we just detected the enzyme or the toxin for ricin, and we don't know if it's real or not, but we want you to check it out. Okay. All right. So those all sound great, don't they? Well, in theory, they are. So the United States, after 9/11, started a program called Top Off, and Top Off stands for top officials. So top officials in certain counties, states, different places have what they call tabletop exercises. So they all get together and someone hands them a piece of paper that says, this is happening, and how are you going to handle it? So basically they're tasked with responding to a bioterrorist incident, even a biological accident, biowarfare, any of that kind of thing. When I say it started in 2000, I think 2000, right after 9/11 attacks. Okay. So, this is supposed to allow them to find weaknesses in their system, correct them, and so that we're more prepared. So the first one was in Denver in May of 2000. They had a simulated biological aerosol release of Yersinia pestis on the city of Denver. Now this is simulated. Remember, they didn't actually do it. They just were in a room and someone came in and said, there's been a biological aerosol release of Yersinia pestis over Denver. And then they go from there. So these are the results. It was estimated that in a very short time, 3,700 cases of pneumonic plague and 950 deaths occurred. That was like in a week. And then it rapidly rose henceforth. The roles of people in charge, very unclear. They didn't know who was supposed to call the CDC, who was supposed to do public communication, who was supposed to do this. And then also they discovered that political ramifications could affect what happened by great margins. So you might think back to when we have the COVID pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, or the COVID pandemic, either one, I guess it's okay for that. There was a lot of different responses for that. Which leaders said what, one governor said this, another governor said that, and that was contradicted by the city. It was crazy. Communication among the hospitals during this exercise was not possible. They were unable to basically track epidemiological information. So hospital A didn't know what hospital C was seeing, and hospital D didn't know that anything was happening with these, etc. So there was very poor access to information and data. So sharing was one of the real problems. The decision makers were not able to really make important decisions, such as how and when to distribute antibiotics. They lacked the knowledge. They lacked knowing how to do that. They lacked the ability to make recommendations for containment measures, who and what to communicate regarding the public. They didn't have a plan to distribute small numbers of medications that were available, who should get it first, who should not get it at all. And a single individual, check this out. So they ordered some antibiotics, ordered in theory, from the national stockpile. But they didn't have a plan on how to distribute those. So they had one individual for all the 16 hospitals counting the numbers of pills and then distributing them to the different hospitals. And they were able to treat 140 people per hour. And the city of Denver is 1 million people. So you can imagine the clamoring for those antibiotics and what might result from there. Okay, so not a good scenario. There was also poor disease containment and quarantine. First, they just isolated the very first patient because the hospitals weren't talking. They didn't know that there was a lot of other patients. And then some of the doctors didn't know what exactly how to treat it or what to do with it. Next, they restricted travel, enacted travel restrictions, and then they closed the Denver airport and state borders were closed. But in the debrief, they figured out that they didn't know how they were going to feed all of these people. How were they going to provide medical services to people who weren't sick? So lots of other challenges. And then there was the communication to the public was not done and very unclear. They didn't know if the public had the legal right to know. They didn't know if they should tell them the severity of it. They didn't know if they should downplay it. So they didn't know if what they communicated would cause panic or decrease panic. So you can see it was just a cluster F. Didn't work out well at all. Total failure. Yeah, not good. So what do you do when you have a failure? Try it again. Hop off 2. In May of 2003, they had a tabletop exercise where Chicago hospitals reported an increase in a common illness. So for instance, a bunch of flu that shows up in the middle of summer. 64 hospitals participated, and it was the largest mass illness exercise ever undertaken. And, they've learned a lot from Top Off 1. So hopefully we're going to go smooth here. No. So exhausted and overextended staff demonstrated the limits on adequate functioning and ability to provide services over an extended period. Where have we heard this before? Yes, with the coronavirus. And, people, healthcare workers got sick too. And so then there was fewer. And then those who were working got even more tired. There was also a lack of a treatment distribution plan. Same as in Top Off 1. Inconsistent information was provided to the public. There was confusion about who was supposed to request supplies from the Strategic National Stockpile, which delayed, treatment, etc. There were communication difficulties. At one location, participants were relying on ham radio operators to connect hospitals. Information then was copied manually at each hospital to a form. Then the form was faxed to a collection point, a common location where everybody was faxing their information in. And of course, faxes aren't always clear, right? Sometimes you can't read them. And then all of these forms came in, and then someone or some people tabulated them into an information system and then sent them back out. So you can imagine the time that would take. There was no centralized database for accurate information collection or reporting. Public communication, like Top Off 1, no consistent messaging regarding what has happened, that it was a terrorist dispersal of a disease agent. Didn't learn a lot, did they? Another total failure. Top Off 3, 2005. New Jersey participants were alerted to a biological agent to be employed more than a week before the exercise began. So what happens when you totally fail? You make it easier. You make it easier to do it. Okay, so they were told what was going to happen a week ahead of time, and they were only going to test certain things. They were just going to test the point of distribution response and the communication to the public. They didn't have to figure out what it was. They didn't have to communicate to each other. They just had to do these 2 things, and they knew it was coming a week ahead of time. Ooh, small type here, sorry. So they didn't plan for any distribution, even though they had an advance notice. They didn't know what protective masks should be worn by workers. They didn't know what security was needed. They didn't know how many people they needed. They didn't know what records to keep. Only one pod could only distribute 1,000 drugs in a 4-hour period. Again, this Chicago, I don't know what, it's probably 2 or 3 million people there or in the surrounding areas. And one pod can only treat about 500 people in the 4-hour period. So there was inefficiency in record keeping. Attempts to maintain the records resulted in major inefficiencies. And so some people said, we just shouldn't keep any records at all. Well, yeah, that's handy. And then some people complained that if they were to create lists of people, so they knew who was there, where they were, and all of that, that it would seem like Big Brother. So again, they shouldn't do that. Then public communication. They did do pretty well on this. They recommended telling the public exactly what was happening, how bad the situation was, what the government was doing about it, and what the public should do. So that was a good part. Record keeping, distribution, again, total fail. Okay, they've done it 3 times now. They've made it easier on at least one time. What's happening now? Well, they have had, I'm not going to go into it too much, but they have had 2 additional top off, and it's still not working. Still not working. So let's talk about a parallel, the COVID response, the coronavirus response. So the public information was mixed. There was one person who suggested that people drink bleach. Personal protection ran out for all the healthcare workers. It ran out for people who wanted to protect themselves. There were not enough ventilators. There was no vaccine. We didn't know who was in charge. Was it the federal government? Was it the state government? Was it the county? So for instance, in Arizona, there was a federal mandate that schools, no, yeah, I think it was when schools were supposed to be closed, or maybe the state decided, but our governor said, no schools are to be closed ever during this. So kids went to school, even though, there was massive coronavirus all over, and they were sharing it with themselves and their grandparents, who then couldn't breathe and died. And so anyway, there needs to be a decision about who's in charge here. And that didn't work with coronavirus. And then there were national stockpile issues. So there were some ventilators there, but there weren't enough. And then how did they distribute them? They didn't know how to distribute them. How did they do it fairly? How to do it from one place and then the next. So yeah, again. So now what they do is they have FEMA does a national preparedness report. The last one was done December 2021. So I'll just read through this quickly. First, FEMA should develop a preparedness investment strategy to help designate whole community responsibilities for closing capability gaps, align their resources to close those gaps, and determine how throwing money at it can improve the outcomes. So essentially, in short, fund research on how to respond. And once you do that, fund number 2 and fund number 3. So number 2 is, second, all levels of government should collectively address physical, economic, and social vulnerabilities to reduce risk exposure and enhance the nation's resilience in an increasing dynamic risk landscape. So basically, figure out where the vulnerabilities are, what goes wrong, how, is it communication? Is it inefficient record keeping? What is it? Which they've done 5 times already. And then third, the whole community should strengthen processes within and better connect to address shortfalls in risk identification, impact modeling, and planning. So then basically it's fix those vulnerabilities. So we've seen this in top up 1, 2, 3. We're still not ready. Basically what they're saying, FEMA is saying in 2001, we need to figure out what to do. We need to figure out where to get the money for it. And we need to teach people what to do. Not a good thing. Not a good thing at all. So what do we do? Well, if you're so inclined, I would write your members of Congress or your senators or your governor or whatever and say, what are you doing about bioterrorism preparedness? You could also run for office and, get involved. You could go into healthcare volunteering. These top off and these other exercises, they were called top off originally, then they were called capstone, and then they were called the National Exercise Program. You change the name, but they don't improve the outcomes. So you could volunteer for something like that if there's one held in your area. I also volunteer for what's called the Maricopa County Volunteer Medical Corps, excuse me. And so they send out emails to people when they need like people to vaccinate, or they need people to distribute masks or whatever. So I don't know if there's things like that in California, but you can certainly call your public health department and you can volunteer there. Outside of that, I would say marry a pharmacist or stay inside if you suspect something's going on, because yeah, we're not ready. We're not even close to ready. So anyway, that's depressing, but you know a lot about diseases now. So you just go back to your notes and say, okay, I need to stay inside if this is happening and I need to whatever. So anyway, that's your last lecture. Woohoo! Thank you so much for being in my class. I really enjoyed it. And I hope you have too. Hope you've learned something. And please, my email, you know my email, it's on Canvas. If you want to do it anonymously, you can use, make up an email in Yahoo or Google or whatever, but I'd love your feedback. I really do like to improve my course each semester. And so I appreciate it when you do that. All right. Thanks again. And best of luck to all of you. Okay. Bye for now.